Did you know there's a reference to one of the main Justice League characters in Gumball? This happens in the 13th episode of the 4th season, titled The Comic, where superfan Sarah creates a comic book where she, Gumball, and Darwin form a team, and in it, Gumball is a hero called Heart Laser. When you see the comic, it's clear that it's a direct reference to none other than the Dark Knight himself, Batman. That's just one of the details, references, and Easter eggs hidden in the amazing world of Gumball that we've gathered for you today. And one of them is simply an amazing secret that no one had ever noticed until today. To find out what it is, just keep watching the video. But the reference to Gotham City's protector in Gumball wasn't limited to the beginning. Many people might not have noticed, but in the opening moments of the episode The Game, we see Richard approaching Gumball while he reads a comic book. And if you pause and zoom in, you'll see that the comic book cover reads Badman, an ironic reference to Batman. But more than that, if you look closely, you'll see a character who looks exactly like Batman, wearing a gray suit, black cape, and black briefs. But he does mischievous things in the comic. In one of the Halloween episodes in the amazing world of Gumball, we see a huge reference to one of the most famous horror films of the 1990s. When Tobias and Banana Joe are talking about an urban legend involving Mr. Candy that they end up summoning, it's a clear reference to the film Candyman, where we see the same character that appears in the show terrorizing a group of people who end up summoning Candyman, who, in the show, has the same characteristics, like the hook on his left hand and the thick brown coat, though far less terrifying, of course. Gumball is so funny that they even make fun of and reference the biggest streaming service in the world. In the episode where the boys struggle to access the internet, they decide to create their own video streaming service, which they name Elmore Flick. The service is basically a video with cardboard and the residents of Elmore in the background doing funny roles. And, of course, you know where they got that idea, right? This is definitely one of the funniest references in the show. In the amazing world of Gumball, there are not just one, but several references to anime. But one of the most famous ones is in the episode The Others, where Gumball briefly portrays Goku in his Super Saiyan form. They even gave him blue eyes. It's really cool to see the creators of Gumball also watch this super cool anime. Now, let's move on to some Disney references in Gumball. They don't spare anyone, which is great for us. In the episode The Rival, which mainly focuses on Anice's birth and early moments in the world, there's a scene where Gumball is about to fall into the incinerator where Elmore's trash is burned, but he is saved by Darwin at the last moment. This is a clear reference to the scene in Toy Story 3 where Woody and the toys are about to fall into the incinerator in the same way. In this episode, which takes place 4 years before the show's normal timeline, there's another Disney reference even more obvious. In one scene, we see Gumball and Darwin dressed as princesses. And from the length of Gumball's hair, you can tell it's a clear reference to Rapunzel from the 2010 movie Tangled. As for Darwin, it's not very clear, but he may be representing Belle from Beauty and the Beast because of his brown hair. Returning to anime references, in the Halloween episode, we see Mr. Small, the boys' teacher, dressed as Sailor Moon during the Halloween song that the residents of Elmore sing. But this isn't the only reference to this iconic Japanese show. In another episode, we see Richard Watterson parodying the transformation of the Sailor Moons, which is completely identical to the one from the 1990s anime at Elmore Supermarket. Seriously, this reference is so obvious, and it kind of reveals the age of the people who create the animations and the script of the amazing world of Gumball, as they were kids when these anime shows were on television. In the same episode, where we see the reference to Candyman, we also see another reference to an even more famous horror movie franchise. In the scene, we see Hank, one of the builders of the show, running in desperation, and shortly after, a horror character with long nails and a hat and coat appears, a clear reference to Freddy Krueger, one of the icons of horror movies from the 80s and 90s. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. And if you're a fan of Gumball, comment down below #7 to see if the show's 7th season arrives soon. Not only movies, anime, and comics are the source of Easter eggs in the amazing world of Gumball. There are even references to some of the most famous video games in history. One of them happens in the episode The Parasite, where we see Gumball and Darwin merging and transforming into a horrifying creature to show Anice how her new friend was a parasite. If you've played this game on PlayStation, you'll know that the image is a clear reference to The Last of Us, a survival horror game that includes a creature called the Clicker. Another reference we see in Gumball is the super famous fighting game Street Fighter. This happens when Gumball and Darwin simulate a battle, and the graphics automatically resemble those used in the old 8-bit Street Fighter games that were played by millions of children, including a version of the Hadouken thrown by the brothers. Returning to horror movie references, in another Gumball Halloween episode, because there are several, the show's creators decided to reference another very famous horror film. When Leslie and Alan find an old cassette tape on the ground, we later see a bizarre figure with long hair coming out of a well. This entire scene is inspired by the movie The Ring, which features a cassette tape in its plot and a creepy girl who crawls out of a sinister well. Speaking of historical films once more, you might recall the episode The Flower, in which Gumball becomes completely possessed by a jealous spirit towards Penny's cousin Leslie. To get rid of this evil entity with Carrie's help, they perform an exorcism ritual, we can say. In the exorcism ritual, the spirit of jealousy is expelled from Gumball's body. And if you've watched Ghostbusters, an 80s movie, you'll notice that the spirit is identical to the Ghost Slimer from the franchise, as it's green and round, resembling a cloud. But this isn't the only reference to this historical film. At one point in the episode, Leslie appears with a vacuum cleaner to suck up the creature, which is also a clear reference to the equipment used by the Ghostbusters to capture ghosts. It really looked like a vacuum cleaner on their backs, even though it actually emitted rays to paralyze the ghosts until they were captured. This is ironic, considering that there's an actual ghost next to Leslie in that scene, Carrie, who ends up being sucked in. Everyone knows that Richard Watterson's main role in the show is to do absolutely nothing. In one episode, the boys discover that he disguises himself as a lady to meet a group of ladies in the mall, who also do absolutely nothing, just like him. This one is really hard to notice for those born in the last 30 years because it's a reference to a 1985 series called The Golden Girls, which tells the story of a group of retired ladies. This was probably the most challenging reference to be detected by most Gumball fans who hadn't heard of this successful 80s sitcom. Speaking of game references, once again, we see a clear reference to the Legend of Zelda game, one of the most popular action-adventure RPG games in history, in the episode The Console. This happens when we see Gumball picking up a game with the name The Legend of Elmore. Returning to references to Disney productions, in one episode, we see Gumball and Darwin in a kind of space council. And for anyone who has watched Star Wars or seen a reference to the most famous galactic adventure saga, they will realize that it's a clear reference to the Jedi Council. And that green guy is a reference to Master Yoda, the Supreme Jedi. In Gumball, there's also a reference to the horror movie Scream, in the Halloween episode when Sarah, Gumball, and Darwin's superfan receives a call from an unknown character. And soon after, we see that it's none other than Ghostface, the villain from the Scream franchise who always calls his victims before attacking them. And, as it couldn't be missing, there's a character, probably the scariest among all in Gumball, who is completely inspired by a story that gave rise to one of the scariest horror movies of all time. We're talking about the Clown, that expressionless being that seems to be always staring directly into the depths of your soul. This character is a clear reference to Pennywise the Clown, the villain of the It stories and movies. There's even a creepy theory about this character and its connection to the clown created by Stephen King in It, as we mentioned in one of our videos here on the channel. Videos about Gumball are always very cool and fun, and to continue exploring quality content, we've selected these videos that we're sure you'll enjoy. Watch them and then tell me how it went, right here in the comments. Oh, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.